Suppose you have to paint something, but you're not sure what type of paint will last the longest in your climate. How would you go about choosing the right paint? Suppose you're getting ready to play a game of basketball on a playground with blacktop. How would you decide which basketball shoes would be best on blacktop? These are not easy questions to figure out, but we frequently attempt to answer questions just like them. These problems can be solved using a process called the scientific method. What is the scientific method? What steps are in the scientific method? And how can it be used in our everyday lives? During the next few minutes, we're going to answer these questions and others as we explore the scientific method. Scientific discoveries are largely responsible for the relatively healthy, comfortable lives that we lead. The development of vaccines, knowledge about how to grow abundant fruits and vegetables, and the invention of useful household appliances are the result of scientific activity. You observe. How does this weather satellite help scientists? The weather satellite helps scientists better understand and predict the weather by taking images of weather systems across the globe. The general goal of science is to better understand the world around us. Scientists use a variety of tools and methods to gain understanding and knowledge. The scientific method is one of them. It's a systematic approach to solving problems and answering questions. In this program, we'll take a broad look at all the steps in the scientific method. Today, scientists are working on thousands of unsolved problems. These problems include finding cures for diseases, developing more fuel-efficient cars, and finding ways to predict earthquakes. Most scientific investigations begin with a problem or a question. Let's create our own question. Suppose you're walking on the beach one winter day and notice that pools of salty ocean water are not frozen. You observe. How is the water in this nearby freshwater pond different from those salty pools? The water in the freshwater pond is frozen, but the puddles of ocean water are not. Why? Scientists often spend a great deal of time defining a problem or trying to ask the right question. Let's create a question from this puzzling observation with the puddles. What causes fresh water to freeze at a higher temperature than ocean water? In order to answer a question, it's necessary to find out as much as possible about the topic. Scientists often spend a lot of time reading and talking to others familiar with the topic. To answer our question, you might observe several different bodies of water along the seacoast to note differences and similarities. You might also gather information about the different characteristics of seawater and fresh water. The goal of gathering as much information as possible is to create a reasonable and testable hypothesis. A hypothesis is a well-informed proposed solution to a scientific problem. For instance, a hypothesis to our problem might be that seawater freezes at a lower temperature because it contains salt. Now, let's see how we go about testing this hypothesis. Experiments are commonly conducted to test a hypothesis. Even though you may not realize it, you've conducted many experiments in your life. For example, when you were learning to talk, you experimented with different words to get the things you wanted. And when you got older, you may have experimented with athletic or musical techniques. A controlled experiment tests one factor at a time. A controlled experiment is a specific type of experiment that has a control setup and one or more experimental setups. The control setup and experimental setup share all the same factors except for one, the variable. The variable is the factor that's being tested. To answer our question, we'll design an experiment in which salt, or more specifically salt water, is the variable being tested. All other factors will be the same for both setups. We'll use 2 equal-sized containers with the same amount of water. The water in both containers will have the same starting temperature. The container without salt is the control setup. The experimental setup will contain salt. We'll put the same amount of salt found in seawater into the container of water. We'll then put the containers next to one another in the freezer. You decide. What do this thermometer, balance, and meter stick have in common? That's right, they're all measuring tools. Scientists use a wide range of measuring tools. Measurements are commonly recorded as numbers. Recorded observations and measurements are called data. Recording and analyzing data is one of the most fun parts of the scientific method. In our experiment, we'll use a thermometer to measure the temperature of the liquid in each container every 5 minutes. Let's record the temperature in a data table. We also need to note the temperature at which the water freezes in each container. After the data has been collected, it needs to be analyzed. This type of graph is called a line graph. The blue line represents the freshwater temperature, and the red line represents the saltwater temperature. In our project, we found that the salt water froze at a lower temperature than the freshwater. The last step in the scientific method is stating a conclusion. A conclusion is a summary of your findings. Data and other information are useful in making a conclusion. In our project, we found that the salt water froze at a lower temperature than the fresh water. Therefore, we can agree with our hypothesis and conclude that seawater has a lower freezing point than fresh water. While it may seem like the scientific method is an easy and straightforward process, it isn't always. Scientists often only use part of the scientific method, or they may repeat one part of it many times. Even though scientists might not follow the scientific method step by step, they use many parts of it to organize their thoughts and their work. During the past few minutes, we've explored the scientific method. We learned that the goal of science is to understand the world around us. The scientific method is a process that helps us gain understanding, solve problems, and answer questions. The various steps in the scientific method were discussed, including defining a problem or question, gathering information, forming a hypothesis, testing a hypothesis, recording and analyzing data, and stating a conclusion. So the next time you face a challenging problem, think about some of the things we've discussed about the scientific method. You might just find solving your next problem a little easier. Fill in the correct word to complete the sentence. Good luck, and let's get started. Number 1. The goal of is to understand the world around us. Number 2. The is a systematic approach to answering questions. Number 3. Most scientific investigations begin with a problem or Number 4. A is a proposed solution to a scientific problem. And number 5. Recorded observations and measurements are called